But in the US, you have different factions within both parties. I've mentioned the sort of three potentially in GOP, but they're also, of course, in the Democrats. If the Democrats cannot get their act together, what does that pose for the next election? But on the other side, what comes after Trump, right?
Democrats are a street fight. They always have been. Republicans are a church. There's an old saying: Republicans are a church, Democrats are a street fight. They just can't. The other version of that is Democrats fall in love, Republicans fall in line about their candidates, that they want to. Democrats, you always say, I need to be excited, I need to embrace the candidate. Like, as a former Republican, it drives me crazy because I'm very used to being a very strategic voter rather than I've rarely loved a candidate I've voted for. So among the Democrats, you have a rank and file that is very different from the kind of upscale, college educated, urban centered younger voters that are increasingly dominating the party leadership.
This is the Global Gambit.
How's it going, everybody? Welcome to this two-part conversation with Tom Nichols, staff writer at the Atlantic magazine and Professor Emeritus at the US Naval War College. I always slightly struggle to say Emeritus. I think I got it right. Tom, it's delightful to have you. We're going to split this into two parts, I think, talking about Trump's domestic status, terrorism bill that you mentioned by Sebastian Gorka, and generally sort of how that's playing into his foreign policy, I think, with China right now. We're recording this ongoing. And then part two for people who are obviously passionate about Russia, Ukraine. We're going to dive into that as well. But it's lovely to finally have you on. We were figuring this out for a little bit, but now that we have you, there's obviously been quite a lot of shifts in Trump's domestic situation. How do you look at his political popularity and how he's navigating all the domestic challenges that are facing him, let alone the war in Iran, Ukraine, etc.?
Well, thanks for having me. Glad we were able to make that happen. I think the thing that's most interesting about Donald Trump's domestic situation and where this interacts with his foreign policy is that this is one of these very rare moments in history where all of the things going wrong at the domestic level have a direct visible link to the president. And that's not usually how it happens. I grew up in the 1970s, and inflation was like a 10-year problem in the 1970s. I mean, it was just always there. It kind of always cracks me up when people say, oh, we have to do something about inflation. And I grew up with this like brutal levels of inflation during the 70s that just never went away. And there were a lot of reasons for that inflation. Some of it was Nixon's economic policies in the early 70s, the oil shocks that came under Gerald Ford in the mid 70s, some of the tax and other policies that Reagan and Carter tried to, but you couldn't just say this guy created this problem. It sort of got smeared out over, several. Poor Gerald Ford, who never ran for president until Nixon resigned, had people wearing "Whip Inflation Now" buttons, as though we could do something about it. This is different. This is a domestic situation where people can say high gas prices are directly related to the president's decision to go to war. High product prices in other areas are directly related to the president's obsession with tariffs. And it's pretty rare that you get moments like that. I mean, I suppose you could point at the George W. Bush administration, say the decision to go to war in Iraq, really scrambles the deck, causes all kinds of economic dislocation and problems. So that was one man's decision, ironically also to go to war. But Trump is struggling with he's a victim of his own success in the sense that he has always argued, I'm in charge, everything happens because of me. Well, when things go bad, you can't just say, well, everything happens because of me, except for the bad stuff. I've said many times that his base will only tolerate anything from him, except two things. Two things he had to promise them when he was reelected. One is about the Epstein files, because he campaigned on that. And a big part of his base is just obsessed with it. And the other was a promise not to go to war. And he's now violated both of those things. So long story short, he is in a world of domestic trouble that is almost entirely of his own making. And he doesn't know how to get out of that.
Well, he puts himself in it. I'm going to be objective in my questioning, challenge you in a couple of things, but just for transparency, I'm heavily critical of Trump, right? I'm pretty critical of everybody, but I think it takes a special kind of person, correct me if I'm wrong, to bring together so many different types of people, right? From the MAGA, parts of the MAGA movement, from, you write from the more democratic side, I would argue.
I'm actually, just for clarity to your audience, I'm actually a former Republican.
Oh, okay.
And I was a 2-time Reagan voter. I worked in the Senate for a Republican senator. I'm one of the never Trump Republican apostates who left the party, who defected from voting for Trump and left.
Would you say you're a traditional conservative in that sense? Because Absolutely. In my regard, I'm not just going to make this a personal interrogation of you, Tom. It's more just simply because what Trump seems to have
the president, I like Diet Coke.
Well, I need one now. I've only got coffee. But what fascinates me is that Trump single-handedly seems to have brought together so many different walks of life, as I say, but that includes alienating some of his own MAGA base. So now you've got sort of 3 factions within the GOP. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you've got traditional conservatives, the sort of the people who you would have voted for Mitt Romney. Then you've got the isolationist MAGAs, and then you've got whatever Trump's MAGA is now, or hawkish, warmongering, neocon. I don't know. It's because it's not traditional neoconservative either in some ways.
No.
So I don't know how that's a crude interpretation.
It's interesting that Trump actually, and I said this when he went into Iran, Trump now sounds like the most neocon, whoever neocon. I mean, he ostensibly had always run against neocons. And let's be clear about what we mean about neoconservatives. People who think that you can employ American military force to do good things in the world, right?
Yeah.
A kind of, under Reagan, they used to call Reaganism enlightened Wilsonianism. Well, nobody thinks very well of Wilson anymore. But this notion that it's not just for pure self-defense, that you can go and you can institute democracy, that you can do coercive non-proliferation and regime change and all those things, during that very muscular period in the 1990s when the Americans had no real peer in the world. And Trump and others ran against that. They said, this is the globalists, the Bush people, the zombie Reaganites, and so on. Trump starting a war in Iran for regime change, and let us not be distracted by what he says now, that it was all about the imminent, 2 weeks to a nuclear weapon. That's just nonsense. He started this war with the explicit charge of regime change. The night the war began, he told the Iranian people they were going to get their government back. That's partly what caused this huge fissure in the Trump GOP, because they really believed the Trump movement, not just MAGA, but the kind of satellites around MAGA, they really believed that they'd vanquish that kind of neocon thinking from Washington. And then Trump emerges sounding more like George W. Bush or, John Bolton or whoever, more than any neocon would have dared to say even 10 years ago. So yeah, there's a MAGA base that is not really a political base. It's a cult of personality. They just kind of worship Trump. They buy his meme coins. They, have pictures of him on their vans, whatever. Then there are the kind of hangers on, as you call them, the isolationist GOP, who say, well, we're trying to remake the international order away from American internationalism toward a more isolationist America First movement. And all of those groups now don't know how to talk to each other because Trump is not consistent. Trump has no worldview. He's a goldfish. He darts from issue to issue, from one shiny thing to another. And that puts, I was talking with someone yesterday and I said, it's always been kind of entertaining to watch Trump say something And then all of his staff and supporters get way out on a limb and say, he didn't mean it. It's not what he intended. That's not, you're misreading him. And then the next thing you hear is this kind of saw behind them, Trump with a saw on that branch going, no, I really meant it. No, I really want Greenland. No, I really intend to,
They try to walk it back and then they cut it.
And they have to start all over again.
Well, if I can just, on this point, so I want to come a little bit to what you think could happen to MAGA and therefore the whole US political system in a moment. But just on Iran, and don't worry for everyone watching, I post daily about the Iran war. I'm not going to make this about the war in Iran. But how much do you think that this was, in my opinion, I think it was just impatience or impulsivity and impatience, right? He got bored with the peace talks in February. He wasn't getting what he wanted. And Bibi Netanyahu and the Israeli ultra-nationalist government basically either, propelled him, convinced him, incentivized him, I don't think coerced into attacking this war. They clearly knew that the IAGC and the inner circle of Khamenei meet on a regular basis on Saturdays to discuss that stuff in the buildings, right, in Tehran. But I think it just happened to be that Saturday that decided Trump was like, screw it, let's go to war. It'll be 4 days, done, bish, bash, bosh, nice special operation, done.
Right. And I think...
do you agree with that, or you think it's...
Yeah, I totally think it was impulsive, but I think it's even worse than you've depicted, because I think it was mostly for glory. I think Trump has had a real sugar buzz from, blowing up boats in the Caribbean, knocking off the president of Venezuela in a one-night special operation, and I think he has long before, in fact, I wrote a piece at the end of his first term warning that one of his last acts might be to start a war with Iran, because he's clearly been itching to do it. In part because I think he sees himself as the great liberator, and that he was going to free the people of Iran, and they were going to put golden statues in the streets of Tehran. And I think where the Israelis came into this is that, like every other country in the world, after watching Donald Trump for many years, the Israelis, just like the Chinese, like the Russians, like everybody else, they know how to play him. We have that interesting kind of inside the room piece from the New York Times a while back, where Netanyahu was basically saying, yes, you can destroy this, it'll fall, it'll be quick. And even John Ratcliffe, who, a Trump loyalist and CIA director, literally using the word farcical to tell Trump, this is farcical. But it struck Trump where he lives, which is this will be glory and parades and fireworks and all that stuff that he thinks, yeah, I think the proof of this has been that more than 2 months into this war, there was no plan B. There was no plan for what happens if the regime doesn't fall. And I'm sure he was warned about this, that because the war in Iran is one of the most gamed out. I used to work at the Naval War College. It's one of the most gamed out, studied hypotheticals in the American military for 40 years. And I'm sure he was told, look, that regime isn't that fragile. They'll close the strait. They're going to attack our Arab friends and allies in the region. I mean, there's all kinds of things. And I think Trump just said, because Trump has a tendency to want to wish things into existence. It's like, yeah, but it's going to happen. It's going to happen. See this with just to take this away from foreign policy, just like he did with COVID and other things. That's going to be, this is it's a nothing deal. It's going to be over, be a week, 2 weeks. And, here we are 2 months. And I would say that we are now the United States facing a strategic loss here.
Well, if I can put this into current developments, right? This part one will go live today because of how timely it is. But I'm just curious, according to Reuters and a couple of other media, Xi and Trump have basically agreed that Iran cannot be allowed to have a nuclear weapon, which is interesting that it's that definitive. But they've also come to an agreement that the Strait of Hormuz must be resolved, and both of them have to be partaking in that. Iran seems to have seized a couple of ships at the time of recording, and this idea of a toll booth still looms heavy. What does that tell us about Iran's capacity to leverage over the Trump administration, over Trump himself? Because to me, this war doesn't seem like the US versus Iran. It looks like Trump versus Iran. Because to what you said earlier, Trump undermines his own cabinet, own administration on a daily basis. And then they have to walk back, clarify, and the whole thing's a mess.
Yeah, and the statement that, well, we agree Iran should never have a nuclear weapon, that is a cost-free nothing burger of a statement. Because the Iranians 10 years ago said, fine, we're not going to get a nuclear weapon. The Iranians played a very clever game. They said, we're not going to get a nuclear weapon. We're just going to have all the parts and pieces, just nearby. And we'll negotiate, and we'll start handing over. But it's not that hard to enrich uranium, and they play this very cleverly. So now it costs no one anything to say, okay, fine, no nuclear weapons. I mean, Trump has decided that because the regime change war failed, this is now what the war is about. And I think the Chinese have said, fine, we agree, no nuclear weapons in Iran, because try to think of the alternate case. And in what world would China say, no, we really have to defend the right of Iran to have a nuclear weapon? They don't do that for anybody. Nobody, the established nuclear powers don't do that. They don't encourage other countries to get nuclear weapons. So take that part off the table. The rest tells me that China and Iran are talking, that the international community, international diplomacy is taking place without the United States, without our knowledge, without our participation. And I suspect, given just from the first reports of the meetings in China that I've been watching, she is not only kind of just as Netanyahu and others have done, not only managing Trump with, parades and honor guards and all that stuff, but he's speaking to the rest of the world. Before you and I started talking today, I mentioned that she had said something about warning the Americans about the Thucydides trap, right? Trump has no idea what that is. She knows that he has no idea what that is. That's Xi Jinping talking to the United States and its foreign and security policy bureaucracy and to the rest of the world.
Well, I wonder whether or not he knows how to even sort of say it, let alone spell it. Like, can he actually sort of pronounce it? It's quite a complicated word for someone, and I think of Trump's intellect to say, Tom. But just quickly on the straight, given your maritime expertise and experiences, like, what are we looking at here? Just simply, like, how well can the United States manage this situation? We had military escalations last week over the miscalculation, and then the counterstrikes to UAE and all this sort of fog of war. Should we just summarize it as? So, how long can the Strait of Hormuz specifically go round and round before someone has to give?
Well, I'm not going to claim too much for my expertise. I'm not a naval officer. I'm not a ship driver. I've never, I don't have that level of detailed maritime knowledge. I think what's disturbing in all of this, and again, I don't know how long it can go on, but clearly longer than we expected, because the most disturbing report is the one that's just come out a few days ago that says that Iran basically still has lots of capability left. That is, that dovetails back into the domestic problem, which is Trump has been going out, especially now. Trump's opponents don't believe what he says, right? I mean, the president comes out, speaks, Democrats and others kind of roll their eyes and say, well, whatever. But Trump, his base, his people expect him to say something reasonably true. So when he comes out and says, we've obliterated the nuclear program, we've completely stripped them of their military capability, we've neutered them and decimated them, and then the CIA and the Pentagon leak that, no, they still have access to 30 out of 33 launchers along the strait. They still have, 90% of their missile capacity. Two things are immediately apparent. One is, I don't know what we've been doing for 2 months, but I would like a better answer about what we've been doing for 2 months if that much stuff is left. And the other is, clearly the Iranians have the ability to keep making people in the region miserable, including us and including shipping in the strait. So I was really kind of gobsmacked at that. I mean, I really thought that the damage, I guess I sort of believed the briefings, at least General Kane's part of them, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. But to find out that they have that much capability left, that's I suspect that's why Trump is going to look for some way to throw up his hand, maybe to do more airstrikes first as a face-saving measure or something, and then throw up his hands and say, I'm just bored with this. Because the one thing I think that most analysts of this situation would agree on is, if you really want to put an end to this and you really want to get that kind of granular control over that whole situation in the strait, you're going to have to land troops, and nobody wants to do that.
So you write a lot on national security, and that is obviously quite a big national security consideration. But simultaneously, we've just had this counterterrorism bill passed last week. I think you mentioned,
it's
right?
not a bill. It was a report issued by the White House by their counterterrorism czar, Seb Gorka, who's an assistant to the president. And it's the official 2026 U.S. counterterrorism strategy.
And they go after violent left-wing extremists,
it's a mess.
Transgendered ideology. How does one assess sort of, because when I was living in Washington, that was during the Black Lives Matter, and one of the running narratives from the Trump administration before they went out was that this is all Antifa. But as far as I understand, there isn't a centralized core hub of Antifa. No one really understands what it is. It's just sort of a collective entity of different groups of people, and the MAGA movement have tried to pin it down as this radical left-leaning entity. Can you dissect that?
Yeah, the White House has always wanted to capitalize Antifa, and talk about it as if it is a coherent transnational, like Spectre, in a James Bond movie. When in fact here in America, you have like middle-aged moms who call themselves Antifa. There's some street goons for sure that show up in balaclavas and call themselves Antifa. This is not some, organized. But let's put it this way: not nearly as organized as groups like the Proud Boys and other right-wing militias that were not mentioned at all in this counterterrorism strategy. But it's a way of, first, I think the report really signals the amateurish incompetence of the guy who wrote it, of Seb Gorka, who has been a self-styled terrorism expert for years, has no background in it, has no real scholarly background in it, has no practical experience with it. He's basically a kind of a Fox News, talking head kind of guy.
I've spoken to Seb Gorka a couple of times. He blocked me on X because I was too provocative in challenging him on some of what he said.
I know people he blocked because they teased him about his car. That's pretty.
But can we acknowledge, though, that the left part of the spectrum on certain issues can be as problematic as the right, right?
I'm not going to both sides that one. I mean, I think there are. I grew up in the 70s when the violent American left was a really organized thing, when they were blowing up post offices and bombing the Pentagon. And groups like the Weathermen were making bombs in New York City. That was the kind of the heyday of violent left-wing terrorists. Yes, there are people who espouse left-wing views who commit violence. But what this report tries to do is to say, I mean, it was really weird, like, left-wing, radical transgender, anarchist. And I was like, they're, for years, the most dangerous groups in America have been right-wing groups, but they're not. This isn't a statement about counterterrorism. This is a statement about who the Trump administration likes and doesn't like. And I mean, there were even passages in it that had really nothing to do with terrorism. I noted in my piece that the report rightly points out, for example, the violence being done to Christians in Africa. It then adds the needless hyperbole that Christians are the most persecuted people on earth. I think there are other groups might take issue with that, but that's not really a counterterrorism issue. That's a human rights issue. That's an international security issue. But it's there as red meat to say, we, the Trump administration, we're protecting you from the African Islamist extremists that kill Christians, and from the crazy transgender people, and from the left-wing, anarchists in the streets. It wasn't a counterterrorism strategy. It was more like a screed. It does, in fairness, list Islamist terror as a major threat to the United States. Well, yeah, of course, Interestingly enough, it identifies Iran as the most serious source of this. When a couple of months ago, it downplayed the threat of Iran, almost as if something's happened in the past few months that could elevate the terror threat from, Iran, which goes unremarked in the report. But then it adds in this about narco terrorists, that people running drugs from Central America or Latin America are terrorists because they kill Americans. That's just a retroactive. Again, why did Trump do the Latin American boat strikes? Why is he doing it? Because of vanity and glory, and to show, to put it out there, look at the things we can do. Look how tough we are. Look at me being, the guy bombing boats. But that's not an anti-terrorist thing. I'm sorry. Drugs are bad. I think we can all say that, fentanyl is bad. Okay. But that, it is not a terrorist attack to run drugs into the United States. It's a law enforcement problem. It's a crime problem. It might be a public health problem in some dimensions, but a terrorist operation.
Out of all you said there, Tom, just okay. I might have to, if it's okay with you, I might just clip that bit and put it in on short.
I'm a big South Park fan, as you can tell.
My last question on this segment is two-pronged question. Obviously, the debate over left and right plays into the two prevailing parties. We've got a political crisis here in the UK, so Keir Starmer might be on the way out. It looks like a power vacuum occurring. But in the US, you have different factions within both parties. I've mentioned the sort of three potentially in GOP, but they're also, of course, in the Democrats. So my first question in this is simply, if the Democrats cannot get their act together, what does that pose for the next election, let alone the midterms, right? Yeah. Because you've got AOC types, okay, left-leaning, very anti-Israel, understandably. But then you've got the more centrist, traditional Gavin Newsom, right? Maybe Kamala Harris is going to run again. So how does the Democratic side? Because right now they're not offering a better alternative, right? To the Republicans. Is it Marco Rubio who tries to dilute the MAGA movement or unify the party? Is it J.D. Vance who takes MAGA and does something incredibly more different with it? Does Trump try to do something again? You know what I mean? How the two different prongs, Democrat side, Republican side.
Well, okay. So part of the problem for the Republicans is that Trumpism is not portable. It doesn't port to it. Cults of personality don't scale. I mean, every authoritarian regime has learned this the hard way, that, there's one authoritarian leader and it's very hard to put that mantle onto somebody else. So when Trump is out of the picture, either because of elections or nature, you're not going to have Vance, who has, the charisma of a zucchini, standing up and saying, I'm the new Trump. And I suspect that a big part of the MAGA coalition will simply opt out of politics again, which is what they did before Trump. The Democrats, part of this is the traditional problem between Republicans and Democrats. There are a lot of Republican Trump voters who will not like whoever follows Trump, but they are so used to the party discipline of voting for Republicans that they'll keep doing it. Democrats are a street fight. They always have been. Republicans are a church. There's an old saying: Republicans are a church, Democrats are a street fight. They just can't. The other version of that is Republicans fall in, Democrats fall in love, Republicans fall in line about their candidates, that they want to. Democrats, you always say, I need to be excited, I need to embrace the candidate. Like, as a former Republican, it drives me crazy because I'm very used to being a very strategic voter rather than I've rarely loved a candidate I've voted for. So among the Democrats, you have a rank and file that is very different from the kind of upscale, college educated, urban centered, younger voters that are increasingly dominating the party leadership. So it's making it very hard for them to talk to working class voters. In the 2024 election, they took a huge hit with Latino voters, young Black men, young men in general. The question is, can they recover that? Now, I think in 2026, the excesses of the Republicans, Pyotr, you said, they're not offering an alternative. I think in a wave election, all they have to be is not the other guy. That's what happens in a wave election.
Yeah, but the sentiment around Gavin Newsom, who's leading in the polls, is pretty.
But
All I
Gavin
ever read
Newsom's not running in
comments on the day of.
2026. Right here, at this point, I'm just talking about the midterm elections.
Oh, okay, fair.
And I think, with a wave election, it's going to be people are going to either not vote Republican or they're going to vote for Democrats because gas is $4.50 a gallon. I hate that. I hate that people vote based on gas prices, and I hated it in 2024, and I said so. But the American public doesn't, a big swath of the American public doesn't pay attention to politics until something kind of grabs their attention and they're standing at the gas station going, hey, what? I mean, I filled up my car the other day. It cost me $85 to fill up my car. I was like, whoa. So that, I think in the midterms, that will happen. I think it is too early to talk about 2028. But I think it's true that the Democrats don't have an obvious front runner. They don't have an obvious unifying candidate. It's not Gavin Newsom, I don't think, who, no matter how much he changes and how adept he is at retail and social media politics, he's the governor. He was the governor of California. It's just a lot of baggage to drag behind you, in 2028. Most Americans love California, but don't want to live there because I say this, by the way, as somebody who just filled out a non-resident California tax return because I'd earned some money in California. And I was saying, oh my God, this is intolerable. This is like longer than my Rhode Island. I live in Rhode Island full time. This is like longer than my Rhode Island tax form, and I live here. And it's not going to, this thing about AOC running in 20. I mean, that's just, there's a certain amount of silliness that's overtaken the media and the Democrats when it comes to these things. Bernie's going to make one more run at 88 or whatever he's going to be, and AOC at 36 is going to jump from a D plus 55 congressional district to national, a national, but it's not, none of those things are going to happen. I would argue that the front runner for the Democratic Party is somebody we haven't seen yet or haven't thought that much about yet. And the reason that we gravitate in these discussions toward Bernie and AOC and Gavin Newsom, it's recognition. It's familiarity. We see them all the time. But in 2028, that Democratic nominee is going to have his or her hands full. And I think it has to be him. I think after running 2 women out of 3 elections, it's going to have to be probably a kind of very standard issue, kind of male candidate, but we'll see, because even that's going to, if Kamala Harris wants to come back in, who knows what that means? I think that would be a dreadful mistake. Mm-hmm. But Democrats are not when people wonder how Republicans became so prominent despite being a decreasing share of the public, some of it was chicanery, some of it was gerrymandering and effectively running kind of propaganda through places like Fox. But it's also because they have kind of this ice cold discipline about how they vote, and that putting their differences aside you saw it with Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell ran the Senate. I used to tell my Democratic friends would say, how do we beat you Republican? I say, be like Mitch, ice cold and focused. And unfortunately, focused is not a word that you often hear with the Democratic Party. So I don't know what will happen in 28. I think 26, it's going to be a wave election. They're going to take the House, maybe even the Senate. But that's mostly because of the sheer incompetence of the Democrats.
Well, on that cliffhanger, everybody, you'll have to find out how this bleeds into foreign policy even more. See you then.